these authorities at a different level. They have a responsibility to provide these women with access to justice, but also to reparation, to at least to give them back something, at least, to give them back some of the peace that they have lost in the last 2 decades now.
This is Nusreta Sivac. During the Bosnian War, she was detained in a mine outside Sarajevo and systematically raped for more than 2 months. Tens of thousands of Bosniak women have suffered a similar tragedy. More than 2 decades later, few have found justice. Amnesty International says fewer than 1% of victims have had their day in court, around 120. The rights group blames bureaucracy and a lack of political will by Bosnian politicians. Amnesty also says a high number of acquittals have intimidated victims from coming forward. Well, to discuss this, I'm joined now from Sarajevo by Bosnia's former Defense Minister Emir Suljagic. In Belgrade is Sonja Biserko. She is the president of the Helsinki Committee for Human Rights in Serbia. And in London, Toby Cadman. He's an international law specialist in the field of war crimes. Thanks all of you for joining us. Sonja Biserko, if I can begin with you, ma'am. Has Bosnia failed to provide justice for these thousands of women?
Well, I think it did, because the access to justice and the reparations and some kind of compensation is very limited to very few women, about 800. And I think even more bigger problem is the social integration of these women, then the high unemployment rate, poverty, and many others. And this is, and of course, the trauma, deep trauma, which is not handled properly because there are not enough services which can handle that, except few NGOs who really look after these women.
Emir Suljagic, do you agree that this was badly handled by Bosnia-Herzegovina over these 2 decades?
Well, it was badly handled by both the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and by the judiciary in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And I can only look at that from the point of view of judiciary, which has completely and utterly actually failed to address these crimes and to, I mean, I understand the difficulties in prosecuting these crimes. I understand the fallout, the difficulties in dealing with the fallout, but our prosecution was completely failed.
Toby Cadman, less than 1% of the total estimated number of victims of war crimes of sexual violence have come to court. Is this a failure by design, or the fact that they were just swamped? Both, if you look at the international community trying to help Bosnia-Herzegovina rebuild itself and bring about some semblance of peace and justice. Was it failure by design, or were they just all swamped? This government trying to hold itself together, hold Dayton together and make things work. Which one was it?
Well, I think it's a bit of both. Obviously, there were a number of cases that were dealt with both on the international and on the national level. I think, speaking for the Bosnian War Crimes Chamber, as it became known, it failed to address the question of sexual violence, only dealt with a handful of cases because it didn't really have a strategy to deal with it. It didn't have trained personnel to deal with these types of cases. And as Sonja has said, it certainly didn't have a well thought out strategy as to what to do after a handful of prosecutions. Unfortunately, many of these women have been left, and only, and I think as Emira said as well, is only a handful of NGOs have actually made any impact on these individuals' lives. But I think the biggest problem is that there was no real strategy from a prosecution level, certainly from the institution that I worked in for a number of years. There was no real strategy on how to address this. And it is a major problem. There are thousands of cases that will never be dealt with.
Sonja, why has it been so difficult to get prosecutions when, in many cases, women can actually point out the men who were involved? They can actually point out the men they say had raped them. They say, oh, these guys are from the village next door. I can tell you who it is. Why has it been so difficult to get prosecutions or to even get this taken to court?
Well, there are several reasons for that. At the beginning, it was stigma of these women who it took time for them to break this silence, and they were very courageous, especially to testify in ISTY and later in Bosnian court. But I would say the Bosnian court generally was not prepared to identify and to properly investigate those cases. And as you mentioned, there are many people who are going around and living along with these victims, women victims. And therefore, there was no political will, I would say, and especially because the Bosnian court has over the years, last years, weakened and decreased, has somehow abandoned this sort of strategy of addressing serious crimes, mostly because all these international experts who were part of the court were abolished, and this is due to the Milorad Dodik's strategy since last several years, 2008. From then many of these experts have left the country, and all these cases are mostly documented by the ISTY, because ISTY couldn't handle all of them, so they transferred many cases to Bosnian court. But unfortunately, not only did the court fail to address these cases, but also society as such, government, and all relevant institutions failed to address the problem of this very vulnerable, highly vulnerable group of victims. There is law in Bosnia recognizing the raped women as civil victims, but and they do have some rights according to this law, but it's not properly implemented. As I mentioned, only 800, I think, persons have an access to this allowance, monthly allowance, which is about 250 euros. In Republika Srpska, it's only 150, and this is not enough for their already, how should I say, traumatic life. And I think this trauma will never go away, but there is nothing much trying to help them to overcome this trauma and to integrate into society in more, how should I say, with more dignity and more acceptance from the society.
Yes. Emir, there are more than 20,000 wartime sexual violence survivors. Is it true what Sonia pointed out, that it seems as if systemically these women have been abandoned legally and societally because they're not a top priority when it comes to healing the wounds of the past?
Well, there was no doubt about that. I mean, I used to work as a correspondent from the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, and I know for a fact that in some instances, some of the victims of rape had to be literally smuggled out of their families without their husbands and their families knowing that they were going to The Hague to testify against their rapists. And the social stigma was just only one of the challenges. There's also, I mean, speaking of stigma and speaking of the society's lack of interest or essentially taboo surrounding this issue, there's also the issue of sexual violence against men that was perpetrated during the war, and of at least two different camps and two different incidents or series of incidents of sexual violence against men that was never, and that it's very likely never to be addressed. The issue with the prosecution of war crimes and crimes against humanity in Bosnia and Herzegovina was that it was supposed to have been done on a schedule, and you don't deliver justice on a time schedule. You don't deliver justice on a budget. You either set out to deliver justice and fully aware of the goals that you want to reach, the impunity that you want to prevent from taking root into society, and so on and so forth. You don't do that because you have a budget and you have a schedule. And unfortunately, the justice, the international community in Bosnia and Herzegovina, especially after 9/11 and after the focus has shifted from the Balkans, has essentially decided that they have had enough and that it was time to put an end to this. And, unfortunately, a lot of the local political class was too happy to oblige.
Yeah, a profound point there. You don't deliver justice on a schedule. Toby, let me ask you, legally, help me understand, amid the chaos and brutality of war, many of these women can identify the men they accuse of raping them, but many cannot, right? Because you had these kind of marauding gangs or militias and so on and so forth. When it comes to that, who do you hold to account legally when somebody's been raped, but it was done by a group? Is it the commanders? Is it the politicians? How does this work?
Well, I think the first point to re-emphasise and certainly for me to support is the point made by Emir. And before I answer your question, I really want to emphasise this. The international community made a huge mistake when we first set up the Bosnian War Crimes Chamber, because the suggestion was, and the message was, that every case would be dealt with, which unfortunately is not possible, because unfortunately justice is bound by the resources that you have available. And the international community left far too early. As Emir said, there were other considerations. And so the whole question of establishing an effective justice and accountability mechanism failed for a number of different reasons. So I mean, that's really something that really does need to be looked at. It's not, you can't put a timeline on doing something of this gravity. You know, there needs to be a long-term commitment, which unfortunately there wasn't. In terms of when you can't actually identify the person that raped you, I mean, clearly the case doesn't fall with that. In most of the cases that we dealt with that were East Bosnia cases, particularly around Foča, Visegrad, areas like that. I mean, there were units that were going around committing these crimes, mass rape and sexual violence, and there were special houses set up, almost like brothels, where young Muslim women were raped and tortured. And so, all that you require to do is to establish a chain of command who is responsible for that particular unit. Because if the foot soldiers are carrying out these crimes and the commanders are made aware of that, they fail to prevent, they fail to punish, then there is responsibility. And so there were a number of cases, certainly 2 cases in the very early days of the Bosnian War Crimes Chamber, Jankovic and Stankovic. They were both prosecuted on the basis that they had control, that they didn't actually necessarily carry out the crimes themselves. There was also the Lukic cousins as well. So cases have been brought, but again, it requires a certain level of specialist knowledge that wasn't always really used in a lot of these cases on the domestic level. And again, a lot of the emphasis was just at the state court, and there were no resources given to the cantonal and district prosecutors' offices and courts. So it was a huge failure, both by the international community and by the national governments.
Sonia, let me ask you, what can the government of Bosnia-Herzegovina do right now, very practically, as an initial step to instill some confidence and to make a lot of those women believe that they're taking this seriously now?
Well, apart from this judicial justice that we just talked about, I think it's much more important to create social atmosphere, that these women are accepted socially, that their status of war or civilian victims is being recognized not only by the government but also from society. And I think there should be much more, how should I say, campaigning in favor of these women through media, education, and generally public sphere, because this is something that can repeat. And this past from 90s has not been handled properly. Unfortunately, the region hasn't been able to reconcile, and Belgrade is denying any involvement or any responsibility for whatever happened in Bosnia. And even the judgment on genocide in Srebrenica was attributed to the Republika Srpska army. So it's totally disconnected from Belgrade. And I think, except that there are NGOs and groups in Belgrade which greatly campaigned against this denial in Serbia and in favor of reconciliation and acknowledging the crimes and everything that has been done in Bosnia against Bosniaks. But Bosniak society I'm afraid, is also conservative as others in the region, and this is a very painful fact to confront, to face, and I think this is something that has to be done, worked on very carefully and very systematically. Otherwise, these women will never have any chance to regain their dignity, especially, and not to speak about their economical and social survival.
Yes, of course, and we hope that there is the political will and money available to give these women the access to medical, psychological and financial assistance that they are asking for. Very powerful report from Amnesty International, which is one of the reasons why we're talking about this. Unfortunately, I'd love to continue talking, but I have to move on. Emir, Sonia and Toby, I thank you all for joining us on the Newsmakers.